So thank you all for coming. So Zoasophy. So Kate and I had a good conversation with a little help from Bill last time. So the alternate recording off. So the place I wanted to start was actually, I was really struck by, we were discussing autoimmune diseases, how about parts of ourselves attack other parts of ourselves because we think they're bad or evil or not us. And I think that one of the interesting ideas of tension is kind of the same idea of being at war with ourselves. And that manifests in all sorts of interesting ways. The most interesting one that came up was this issue of the boss role. So just to kind of get everyone up to speed, let me share my screen here. I can do this in a way that's less distracting. So this is the kind of the chart I've been going here, where I'm sort of mapping these tensions of de-individuating self and other, disconnecting self and other, rather these tension relievers into different traditional roles. And most people seemed okay with the other three roles, but the boss role really tended to trigger a reaction. Kate, is that a fair summary of our previous conversation?
I would argue that I disagree with all of them. It's just the boss was the easiest one to use as an example initially.
When you say you disagree that they exist?
Or no, I think they exist. I just disagree that they are healthy.
Well, first of all, so yeah, so let's pick our words, right?
Yes.
So healthy is a strong word, unhealthy is a strong word. I've been using the weaker word adaptive.
Yeah, right? I don't.
Which is to say that in certain contexts, that when we're under tension, and the tension is unbearable, we can't persist in that tension, that one of the ways that we relieve that tension is by sort of weakening one of the constraints and by ignoring sort of one part of the diagram. And the statement was that it is locally adaptive.
Yeah.
In the sense that in a given context, like we talked about in the case of a trauma, of a medical team where you have a dying patient and you need to work in a coordinated fashion to save their life, it is adaptive to make sure everyone knows their role and does it regardless of their personal preferences in order to save the patient's life. I think we agreed that that was adaptive.
Okay, so so I was thinking about that, and I don't think that those agree with your initial premise, because you were talking about tensions and when the tension becomes too great, whereas you then, as an example, used a moment where it's not that the tension is too great in that moment and so it switches. And so what you've done is you've then thought of a time when someone uses a boss role and then retrofitted it to the example, rather than, like, I liked your example of when I'm trying to get my kids ready for school in the morning and I'm running late and I feel all these tensions on me, I snap and I move into boss role in order to tell them that I don't care what's going on in their lives or what they feel or how they're handling things. They are getting out of the house now and they are going to put their shoes on, and that is just what's going to happen. And my counter theory to your theory is that spiritual maturity, or maturity in general, is being able to hold tension better for longer and not needing to find the relief. Because my position to you is that any way that we relieve tension by breaking one of those links is by definition maladaptive.
Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, so help me understand the difference between my example of getting kids out the door and a head doctor rallying the team to save a patient's life. What is the difference between those two from your perspective?
Well, for starters, the tension in the first one is more of an internal tension. So we're talking about the roles that we take on as individuals because the pressure that we are under or the tension that we find ourselves in is one that we cannot cope with. And
slow down. Did you repeat that sentence? Because I feel like there's something important there.
So the way that you just described it in your introduction was tensions are a natural part of life. And when we find ourselves in a tension that becomes too great for us to handle, we then find ways to de-individuate, disconnect from either self or other in order to break the tension. But that on slide 4 is how we described maladaptation. Because that's anti-tensioning.
Okay, so there's a okay, so this is good. So let me kind of play back to that, because so we talked about anti-tensing is to so I use the word premature detensioning, right? As opposed to appropriate detensioning.
Which I disagree with you on.
Okay, so let's start here then. So from your perspective, all detensioning is unhealthy?
Yes.
And I also have a perspective on this, and I'm more in alignment with what Kate is saying than what I'm seeing these saying. And it's I also need to understand the slides a little bit better myself, because because that helps. But there are times when breaking the tension and going a different direction can be appropriate and healthy. Only if it is to some way, as its goal, still maintain some connection in the relationship, I think. Well, there's always exceptions, but overall, I believe in at some level maintaining, some form of connection, and there's going to be value in that, even if you have to go in a slightly different direction sometimes. But what happens is if we start to use our breakaway as a rescuing thing, and it can become an addiction to break away in different ways. And so that's where I see it as being maladaptive. So if I use watching, I don't know, some television show as a substitute for staying connected with my feelings, then that becomes maladaptive. If I run away instead of facing and owning my own problems, that's maladaptive. It's all about the essences of problem ownership in these slides. I say problem ownership is a core condition.
Ernie, you are now muted.
So the issue of problem ownership is a big one. Does someone?
Just a second, my phone's ringing. I'll be right back. Keep going though.
Right, Janet. Hopefully she will unmute. So I think there's an interesting. So I think so. There's a tension here between us, and I think it would be helpful to find a way of framing the situation to resolve that tension. Would you disagree, Kate?
So is the aim to resolve the tension or to resolve the conflict?
And what is the distinction in your mind between those two statements?
So if I have one position and you have one position, there is a way to avoid the tension between us, or there is a way to find Hegelian synthesis or some other solution that continues to allow the autonomy of both parties, and both parties maintain their individual position, but are able to then reach across and also see the point of view of the other person. So the tension isn't resolved. We don't say, oh, there's no tension, it's fine, don't worry about it. We keep that position and use the friction to generate new ideas or new ways in which we can view the situation, new ways that we can understand the situation, so that it's a generative thing rather than shutting it down to try and get rid of the uncomfortable feelings.
Right. So I think I agree with what you're saying. I'm not sure if I understand why you were breaking that down into tension versus conflict.
Well, I'm just trying to think of a way of basically saying there's solving a problem. So imagine you've got a maths problem. It's got an S on the end. It's maths, not math. And you're struggling to solve it. So you've got a tension between the problem that you're trying to solve and your perceived ability, and you can feel that conflict, and you can either.
Okay. So sorry, the way I'm using the word tension is a little different than the way I think about it when I just have a narrow, like, to me, the definition of a problem, going back to the Latin monks who created these forms and quizzes, was it's a really well-defined system, which can be hard, but it's by definition, it has a right answer. And if you know the right material, it is trivial to solve it. And that there is a challenge there, but I don't experience that as a tension in the same way as what we're talking about here.
Between us?
What?
What's the tension between us?
Well, I think the interesting thing about that is that I can say that there is a tension, and if I knew what the tension was, it's entirely possible that the tension would go away. Like, I don't know right now if we're using different words to mean the same thing or the same word to mean different things, but I can say that, like, there is a tension here in that, like I said, that I think that the statements, these words we have, are that I think roles can be adaptive, at least locally adaptive, and you seem to be claiming that roles are always maladaptive or unhealthy. And I'm not sure if we're even talking about the same thing, or if we're just if we have a disagreement about the concepts, or just a discomfort with certain words. I don't even know.
Yeah.
By the way, this is the most interesting thing that that I'm drawing from this is this is why I've been hoping to put off my I have this hierarchy of problems I'm trying to solve, and one of them was replacing English as a language, and I was hoping to put that off until later, but it looks like I may have to get to that sooner, because English is not a well-defined language.
No.
Because it has 1,000 or so years of history, if not more so, that it's pulling from. The solution to that problem, by the way, is to generate a formal system that manifests these properties. So I can say, I create a new word, grigu or whatever, that describes this exact system when it's behaving in this state is in a state of grigu. And then we all know exactly what the context is for that word and that thing. And
oh, you're a structuralist. Oh,
okay. So I don't know what I've heard that word, but I don't know what it means. I think of myself as a constructivist, and so I don't know if that's the same thing.
So a structuralist believes that if we define everything in context and language properly, we can understand things.
No, that's not actually what I believe.
Okay.
It's sort of the inverse of that, is that the only way to know that I understand something is to build something that demonstrates it. And so it's not like it will allow us to understand everything, but it is to say, if I can create working examples of something, I can say this is the thing I mean. And then I create a word for it to describe that concrete shared experience we have. And then that at least gives us a paradigmatic data point to work from. Because the words like boss or healthy, like one of the interesting things that I noticed, one of the reasons why I wondered whether I don't have the emotional reaction to boss that you and my son had was I spent the last 6 years since I got fired from Matterport working through a whole bunch of emotional issues around father figures. And I wouldn't say I've totally mastered them, but at least I have come to terms with them so that I can see the word boss without negative emotional connotations. And that I don't know yet. That might be part of the reason why I can see the boss role in a very abstract computational sense without any particular value associated with it.
Well, it's also the other words in that category.
Okay.
Like the word bully, for example, is a very negative word.
Right, but you're the one who suggested it.
I know.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So like, and this is trying
And
to
also it
map
should
onto
say
other
rebel
people's taxonomy.
under artist, not revel. Rebel.
Rebel. Yeah, rebel's more on the yellow. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I was listening to Andy Stanley where they talked about so some of these words are negative, right?
Yeah.
And people have negative words associated with that. It's like, okay, does that mean that the thing is inherently bad, or this is the problem with using English language? This is words people have used for similar concepts, and I'm trying to define them in an operational term, and saying when was gold and phlegmatic was green. And this is the problem with language, is we try to map onto words and concepts that people have. But let's talk about let's call it the DIO, right? The technical term is de-individuating others. Is that you're in a situation and the claim is that, and I think let me go back to Janet's point, is like, I think when we talk about, let me actually use this phrase here because I think this is an important distinction I want to make, is that roles, so the move, I guess philosophers like that term, the move of de-individuating the other to relieve tension is, so I'm actually okay using a pejorative word to describe that because I think it is uncentered to kind of weaken the tension, right? To ignore part of the problem to make the other ones easier to deal with. Okay, and the larger point that I'm making is sort of in down here, is that the ideal spot to be in is precisely this this sense of Christing, to be fully connected and fully present and fully redemptive. So in that sense, everything else is in some sense an expedient compromise.
Okay, so the problem I have with this slide is, as an Enneagram Type 9, I have very good experience of the ways in which a 9 is very maladaptive in the term that they use in the Enneagram is in unhealth.
Right, and so this is again the problem with the language and the existing categories is the because what was the statement? All theories are wrong, some are useful.
Yeah.
Right, and so it is useful to some extent to try and map this, but so certainly what I mean by Christing is not identical to what the Enneagram means by peacemaker. And so I don't yet know whether that's a profound or a trivial distinction. Maybe you can explain to me what you see as the common failure modes of the peacemaker.
Inability to hold the tension, which is the key fundamental problem. So rather than holding on to interpersonal tension and being able to handle that, there is a tendency to either deny that there is a problem or to numb yourself to the problem emotionally. And so you withdraw into yourself and actually go into more of a martyr mode where you just kind of ignore your own thoughts, feelings, values, integrity in order to placate the other person and therefore relieve the tension.
Right. So in that case, right, is that this is why I react against the idea that there's a peacemaker type, right? As opposed to I saying, like, when you try to hold the peacemaker role, you can't handle it, and therefore you shift into a martyr role. Right.
Well, so this is the thing about the Enneagram, is that there is a movement. You go closer to a different type. So I probably should say I don't know all that much about it. I am very superficially aware of it.
I understand that's the way the Enneagram talks about it. And I was going to try and do the movements and the lines to see if I can map it in a way that makes sense. I don't know. But like the way that the way that I conceptualize the problem, which is, I believe, and this is a philosophical, technical point, I don't know, right? Is that I am trying to find a simpler set of concepts that explains a larger set of dynamics, right? So by decomposing the emotions into these, 2x2, 3x3 matrix, the hope is that, because the Enneagram never even claims to be scientific, right? It's lore, right? Yeah. I'm trying to grope towards a scientific model, meaning that a large number of phenomena are explained in terms of simpler phenomena and the interactions between them. And so it sounds like this is different than the Enneagram, no question about that. But it sounds like let's play with this concrete example you gave of when you're trying to be a peacemaker or you want to be a peacemaker. Then you mentioned that one common failure mode of that is that you end up denying your own individuality and moving into the martyr role. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, and that, I think that might be an Enneagram thing too. It's worth asking is like, okay, can you imagine being in the other boxes? So the one is, I think the denial thing is sort of disconnecting from other people, which would be what we'd call the artist role. Is that a failure mode for you as well? Or
so yes, like ultimately, if you go deeper and deeper and deeper into their levels of health, because there are 9 levels of health, and like 9 is you are at your ultimate, I don't know, health, the ultimate expression of what you are if you are fully whole and complete and perfect emotionally. And at that point, you can do the kind of, you can take in all the stress around you and you just exude peace, and you can stand on your own 2 feet, Schnauz style, and you can soothe yourself, and you are able to be that kind of calm for everyone else around you. At the worst, you're pretty much catatonic because you've gone inside yourself so much that you just sit and you don't interact with anyone outside yourself because it's just too much. So you've retreated into your own internal world.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that in this framing where the peacemaker is sort of the archetype, is that there's retreating into your own private world. And again, so I'm trying to distinguish between two different types of retreat, right? One is to say, I'm going to, stay sort of physically present and give everyone what they want and just sort of ignore my internal world, which is what I call the martyr. Or there's the artist, which is where I'm just going to disconnect and just forget about it and just go into my own little shell and let you guys fight it out amongst yourselves.
So in a kind of medium level, it's martyry. But then as you go further into unhealth, it's more artist.
Okay, that's interesting. Now let's go in the other direction. So certainly there are some cases where I'm in a situation and I oh wait, there's actually like the exact right word or the exact right tool or the exact right practice or technique that just solves the problem instantly. Like my kids are fighting and it's like, oh wait, we have a thing called a consolation gift because I have two kids. And so when one kid has a birthday, the other kid gets a consolation gift. And so we have a thing like that. And it's like, and my daughter does this for the dogs. When the dogs get treats, the other dog gets a consolation treat. So like, that's a technique. It's like, oh, and when I find like the right technique for resolving, I feel like I'm in joy. I'm in the joy mode because I don't need to dig deep within myself. I can just use a shallow technique and solve the problem, and yay. What's interesting to me is this tied into a conversation we were having about advice, and that there's I was listening to a talk by a Stanford psychologist whose name escapes me about exceptional relationships. And she is very much against advice because it is a emotionally distancing thing to do where you almost infantilize the other and separate from themselves. But it's
power play. There's one person who's in their mind as a higher authority than the recipient. Therefore, there can be no respect. It's between that relationship between peers. It's different with boss to, employee or parent to child, but peer to peer advice is always a form of abuse.
So that's interesting. That's a very strong categorical statement. I'll have to ponder that. Mm-hmm. So like, for example, we have this peer-to-peer format I've been playing with in, DBJ, but one of the things is the question of time. And like when one person really wants to talk about something and, you feel like, oh, I'm sorry, I got to call time so somebody else gets a chance to share. Is that an abuse of power play?
No, there are things to be shared. As long as everybody's treated equally. We used to use the empathy, warmth, and respect scale. So things can be communicated, which are sharing of opinions that can be opinions that can be in disagreement that you hope that somebody else will learn from you. But you don't have to do it in that advising, power playing way, which is what we are the most familiar with doing, in our fallen state, I think. But there are ways to do that respectfully. There's a way to do respectful confrontation, respectful empathy. But the idea is keeping that same person as an equal to you in your own mind and in the value under Christ of who they are and created in the image of God. Always having that idea in mind all about you, Ernie, me, Kate. It's who we are I mean, as in the image of God, I don't ever want to disrespect any of you guys, and work not to. But the way that it's something is done, if it unequalizes and makes me a little more powerful than you, then you start getting into this nebulous, dangerous ground.
Well, yeah, the thing is that I agree with the word dangerous, right? But to me, dangerous is different than evil. And it's a subtle distinction, but a kind of an important one. And the other way I think about this, here's a word that might relieve some tension: coping strategy. Is that when you're sitting in this space, moving out in these directions is a coping strategy. How does that word work for you, Kate?
I agree with it, but to me, coping strategies are needed when you're not mature enough to handle the situation.
Fair enough, right? I think my point is that maturity is hard and unbounded.
Yep.
Right? And so in the larger sense, the goal is to become mature. On the other hand, you also need to survive long enough to mature.
Yes.
And to do that, we need coping strategies that are adaptive, that at least help us resolve, get past the local situations. And it's still useful to distinguish between adaptive and maladaptive, or at least locally adaptive and locally maladaptive coping strategies.
Okay, 1 second. So you would agree that in this infinite endpoint that is very ill-defined of being mature, you don't need coping strategies when you are fully mature.
Right. So the full maturity, right, is defined as being this where you hold. This is essentially my concept of God the Father. He is literally holding everyone's tension all the time, completely.
Yeah.
Okay. That is that is sort of the epitome of total maturity.
Yeah.
Okay. But in this world where we have finite beings and finite resources,
yeah,
there are a necessity to adopt coping strategies to enable us to function. And those coping strategies can be either adaptive or maladaptive.
I see.
Locally, right? So, for example, right? And the global concept. So, locally speaking, the case of, in the local context, we get our kids out to school, like taking the boss role and saying, hey, you got to do this. Or, I would say that, I can imagine this context is that, the surgical team is trying to get this patient, and this, guy just broke up with his girlfriend the day before, and his boss yelled at me, hey, get your head in the game, right? That is locally adaptive in terms of helping them achieve that function. So it's based on a certain context and a certain scope that we're worried about. We can say that having this person step up and take that role and help them fulfill that is adaptive, whereas someone who's like a micromanager who's like nagging at people out of their own insecurity and like telling them how to do the job they're already doing, that would be a maladaptive role within that context, because it's actually making it harder for the group to fulfill its purpose. And that's why I'm using the words adaptive and maladaptive.
But in an ideal situation, you would, one would have the maturity to not need to yell at the children to get them out of the house in the morning, because you would have other ways of holding the tension of time, and find other ways that allow you to get
actually,
out of
I don't think you can have an ideal solution in a bounded context, right? As long as there is
my children every morning
what?
to get them out of the house. I don't shout at my children every morning.
I don't shout at my children every morning, but occasionally there are mornings where my children have not in themselves matured to the point where they can do that. And so there's a difference between, am I mature enough? Are we? So if we're all mature enough, this is easy, right? If everyone behaves within spec and fulfills their roles, everything's fine. The system is running in equilibrium, right? That's not maturity, that's just stability.
So to what extent is this?
It's about being adaptive, right? Is when the situation
but how
changes.
much of this is handling your immaturity and how much is this handling the immaturity of others? Because every example that you've given so far is handling someone else who is having an immature moment.
Right, so the question is, the statement is precisely that the more immature others are, the greater maturity I need to compensate for that. Right?
No,
so it's relative rather than absolute.
You're still starting with others, Ernie. Others begin the trigger point for you to measure your own maturity levels. The way that I'm hearing that, and wisdom is I start with myself, where and I own if a relationship isn't working, I own the piece that I'm aware of that I'm not doing right, and I start there and I own that, and then I go back and try to work in that relationship, being a recipient of grace and starting there. And it cannot be about others every single time.
So I think that I agree with you, and I apologize if my phrasing is misleading or not accurately communicating what I'm trying to say. Okay. What I'm saying is that usually, and this is a confession, not a normative statement of the way things should be, is that when a system is not in equilibrium, where things are not in a flow state, where everything's just going smoothly, my first reaction is somebody else screwed up. And that is the perception I start with. And then I have to go through the reflective process of saying, wait, rather than blaming them for this situation, what is it in me that is not mature enough to handle this perturbation that I need to work on, which I think is the point you're trying to make. Is that fair, Janet?
We'll hang on to that because that's along the right track. But there's a different question that I try to ask. And that is, in my perception, my friend down the street is too bossy for me to handle. And so I'm wondering what to do next step in the relationship. The next step for me is, how am I listening to her to understand to be able to try to understand her preconceived notions about me, about life or whatever, that are making me experience this from her, and what are my preconceived notions that I need to understand, and in listening, that might make me assume that she's doing something that she's not doing. So a lot of it is about what gets programmed into us, into our background. I mean, how we interpret people's tones of voices, how we interpret people's phraseology and everything. But it can be with all this preconceived stuff that we have. How can I open myself up to try to walk in that other person's shoes and think through what might be the issues for that person? And the most powerful tool to do that is to just check it out and say, I'm hearing that you're saying blah, 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 and this is the way it's come across to me. Is that what you really mean? And you check it out. But if I start with me, with the I'm hearing, this is how I'm reacting to it. No assumptions that the other person has even made a mistake.
Right. There's not an assumption the other thing, but the example you gave was you started with the perception that the other person was too bossy for you to handle.
Yeah, that can be the experience.
You're right. That's sort of the trigger.
Yes, that's the trigger.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay.
It's not that other people's cause the problem, but it triggers our perception of a problem.
That's right. And it's about perceptions on both sides. If you can actually find accuracy in the perception in yourself, in knowing yourself and knowing the other person, yes, you can. And if you can articulate that, but it's also in problem ownership too, the way that I see it. Or have experienced it.
Okay. I think we were mostly, so Kate, you were making a question and I don't know if we answered it.
No, but that's fine. It's fun when you don't. I thought that based on what you both said, it sounds like we're edging really close to psychological defense mechanisms.
Yeah, I think that
Coping strategies, psychological defense mechanisms, they all appear to be in that same category of thing. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean,
and I think the goal is precisely, to me, being human is not to demonize those coping strategies or defense mechanisms because they are necessary given our current limited fallen human state, but neither to idolize or even not to idolize them, but to have grace for them and seek to refine them and transcend them over time.
So I'm going to decouple them from like the spiritual language that you were using just then, because it's easier for me to think about it in a different way. So defense mechanisms were first noticed by Freud, and he used it particularly in the realm of repression. So the idea being that there was an experience that someone had that was too existentially difficult for them to hold. The tension between the thing they were experiencing and their own internal world and their own internal understanding was too great, and so they had to push it away. This then got developed further into more refined categories and more refined processes. One of the really most powerful ones that came later was the idea of splitting. And this was taken on in all kinds of developmental psychologists. And so you've got Winnicott and Melanie Klein. Melanie Klein is huge. And she was the one that said that when you've got babies who are going through even breastfeeding, they've got this experience of wanting to be fed and wanting to be close to the mother, but then the breast gets taken away. And so they have to cope with this tension between the feelings that they have of having what they want and not having what they want. And so rather than being able to hold that tension, they turn it into the good breast that gives them the milk and the bad breast that doesn't. And then it's only as they mature and get older that they can learn that actually there is a whole entire mother that is also attached to those things, that and the experience that they're having is part of a whole person. And we do the same thing, even like you only have to look at politics to see the splitting involved. If you're on one side of the argument, you should arrest Fauci immediately. If you're on the other side of the argument, you should give him some kind of sainthood. And depending on where you fall, you demonize the other and you sanctify your own side. And actually, I would argue that maturity comes when you don't have to do that, but you can find the good and the bad on both sides. And that isn't about taking a martyr role and saying, oh, I'm going to ignore my own position, you must be right. And it's not taking a boss role to say, here are the logical reasons that you must listen to my point of view, person on the other side of the political aisle. Because that doesn't work either. But actually being able to listen first and understand their perspective without the need to fix it. You're muted.
So I feel like we're in violent agreement, right? So like, obviously the goal is to be mature enough that we don't need coping strategies.
Yes.
What I'm asserting is that that is a contextual thing. Like I can be mature enough to handle this situation, but that doesn't mean that I'm mature, end of story, right?
Yeah.
It means that I'm mature enough to handle this situation, and a lot of growing up is being more mature so I can handle more difficult situations.
But but the way you have phrased it in your slides is that maturity is choosing which of the roles that you take on. And my position is saying, yes, but you only take on those roles when you're not mature enough to handle the situation.
Well, so the statement is that, in fact, the only role that resolves everyone's tension permanently is Christ. Like that was the ultimate role, okay? But so in the global sense, that is true. On the other hand, it is certainly true in the local sense for having this concept of a coping strategy, I think resolves the tension, really resolves part of the tension between our terminologies here. And I can hope to find a alternative there. But as a practical matter, like I don't want to demonize coping strategies and to say, oh, it's bad.
No.
Right. And so, wisdom is that, so ultimately the most mature way to resolve a situation is to fully inhabit the Christing role, where you're able to incorporate and honor and respect everyone's tension and manage it. In a world of finitude, that is not always the case, but there's still place for resolving tension. For example, having time boxes, like say we have a meeting for 1 hour so that we can get everyone on the call and they know that that's what they've signed up for. And at the end of it, we say, okay, we haven't resolved everything, but I'm going to say we're done now and I'm going to stop the recording, right? That is a boss role, because I could choose not to do that, but it's just way easier to say, hey, we agreed to an hour, we're going to stop at the end of the hour. Or, we can try to stretch it and I could say, okay, let me choose to extend more space and say, hey, does everyone want to stay longer or not, whatever. And then we're okay with it. But that means that Robbie, when he watches this, will have to commit more time to catching up. It's like, those are all choices we make. And,
but you're not de-individuating when you do that.
I am, I'm saying I'm just going to decide that no matter what the rest of you think or want, I'm just going to stop the recording an hour in. Right? That's a choice I can make, and that is a role I am playing because I'm the guy who has the power to start and stop the recording, right? And I'm not saying I will, but I could, and there's an argument to be made that I should, right? And it's a choice. It's a thing that is done, and it is.
I feel like your difficulty is that all of your examples of people inhabiting the boss role
Mhm.
are in a power structure and a power system in which they are given that role by their position in the system. And so it's not a role they are choosing to inhabit. It is a role that they are placed in by nature of the system.
Well,
can you give me an example of a time when someone would inhabit the boss role in a peer group?
Well, by definition, so there's two different things. You said they were placed in that role. So certainly, like in a parenting role, they started as a parent and they chose the kids. In a team lead situation, like a surgical team, I don't know the actuality of the thing. It's often the case, but in engineering, it's often the case that one person volunteers to act as the team lead to run the sprint.
Yes, but that's not inhabiting.
That's different than them being placed in the role.
Yeah, but that's not inhabiting a role to relieve tension. That is proactively taking a power position within a group. That's
so slow down.
Social dynamic.
I understand the distinction there, because precisely the reason we say we have a team lead is we say, okay, we need to get this release done by Friday. At Apple, we had this concept of a designated responsible individual, where someone would volunteer and say, hey, in order to get this done, I will agree to be the point person to make this happen, right? And they don't necessarily have power, but they definitely have authority.
Okay, so can you give me a similar example of a time where someone is elected or within a group is proactively, preemptively given the artist role?
Sure. Kate, I would like you to go away and write down your thoughts about what actually bothers you, so you can come back to the group and present it.
No, that's not. Because
that's actually true, by the way. So we could try it and see whether that actually plays out.
So
that's a great way to resolve my boss role tension, is that it's 12 o'clock. I want to stop and I want you to actually write something. Will you accept that role?
Yes.
All right. Great cliffhanger to end on. We will discuss on the thread when to meet next.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.